Hello everyone and welcome! Do you want to know if a servant is good enough to spend your hard-earned courts on? Then you are in the right place. Welcome to the FGO Gacha Guide. Today's topic servant is the gun-toting outlaw Calamity Jane. We'll cover all the points you can see on screen right now, but before we go into these, fun fact with Jane. She got the nickname Calamity due to her lovers always dying in battle. So if you do like her, then watch out if you want this cheering One-chan on your side. So on to my personal opinion on this servant. Honestly, Jane is not that great. In a game where most archers are very, very good, Jane is middling at best. Her skills aren't great, and her one interesting skill has requirements that are just too high to meet for how weak the buffs are. She's another servant that really suffers from the numbers on her skills being too low. She's debuff focused rather than buff focused overall, which always can be resisted by enemies. At the end of the day, she's not bad, but she's not good either. Let's move on to her stats and start seeing why she is. So, she is a 4-star AoE archer servant, meaning she's super effective against sabers and weak versus lancers. She has 8,996 attack at level 80, which is a little below average for 4-star servants. Her HP at 80 is 12,495, which is pretty high for a 4-star servant, honestly. Looking at her hidden stats, we see that her MP gain per hit is 0.71%, which is nicely above average, very decent. As for her cards, her quick card does 3 hits, her arts card does 3 hits, her buster card does 2 hits, and her extra does 4 hits. This is pretty low hit counts nowadays overall, they're all below average. As for her star absorption, aka how much priority she has to get critical stars on her cards over other servants, it is at 153, which is a pretty darn high stat, very above average. Pretty normal for all archers, all things considered. As for her star creation rate, it is only 8%, a little bit below average. All in all, her stats are honestly above average, not bad, but the unfortunate part is the lower hit count on her cards to not take full advantage of her pretty decent stats overall. Taking a look at her deck and NP, her deck contains 2 art cards, 2 quick cards, and 1 buster card, a non-standard 2-1-2 deck with an extra quick card over a buster. Her noble phantasm, Space Dead Man's Hand, first black hand that beckons death, is a single target quick NP. Did I say AoE earlier? I'm done. Anyway, single target quick NP that hits 5 times, will deal damage to the one enemy while ignoring evasion, lowers their defense for 2 turns by 10 to 30%, and lowers their quick resistance for 2 turns by 10 to 30% based on your overcharge, and both of these debuffs will apply before damage. This is a pretty solid NP overall, not bad. The debuffs applying before damage is rather nice and can help the NP deal pretty solid damage. The issue here is that debuffs can be resisted, so they're not as valuable as buffs overall. However, it does fit into her role, which is more of a semi-support than a main damage dealer. So it helps her do what she wants to do, it's just what she wants to do is overall weaker than just straight up buffs. Next up, we take a look at her passives. Her passives, first off, we have Magic Resistance C, increasing her debuff resistance by 15%. She has Riding A, giving her 10% bonus quick card effectiveness. She has Presence Concealment A for 10% bonus critical star generation rate, and Independent Action A for 10% bonus, or 11% bonus critical damage. Overall, these are some pretty darn amazing passives compared to the usual that you'll see on servants. Everything except magic resistance is very good here and helps with her role. Whether you want her to deal damage, produce stars as a semi-support, or have her as the main damage dealer, all 3 of Riding, Presence Concealment, and Independent Action help her with that role. Very nice. Now let's take a look at her skills. First off, oh my god, it's a mirage, I'm telling y'all, it's sabotage! Beastie Boys? No? Okay, I'm old, I'm sorry. Anyway, this skill decreases the critical rate for all enemies by 10% for 9 to 19% for 3 turns, and reduces their attack by 10% for 3 turns. This skill isn't that amazing. As I've said before, debuffs can be resisted, so they're not as good as buffs in general. On top of that, these debuff numbers are overall pretty darn low. A 19% reduction to critical chance isn't that amazing. You're still going to get crit often enough, especially on any enemy that has a critical boosting skill, because they can just spam it to the point where that 19% reduction is basically nothing. And as for 10% attack reduction, that doesn't do a whole lot when the enemy is doing enough to one-shot you anyway. Next up, skill number 2, we have Galaxy Messenger. This decreases the MP gauge of all enemies by 1. It'll increase her own attack by 10 to 20% for 3 turns, and has an 80% chance to increase the attack of her allies by 10 to 20% for 3 turns, and charges the party's MP gauge by 10%. This skill is okay, I guess. The RNG part of the attack buff seems really unnecessary, considering the buff is not very strong. It feels like it was just tacked on to give her third skill a reason to be used on herself. Speaking of which, let's look at her third skill, and it is a doozy. This is called Show Me the Way Polar Star. This is a buff that only applies to one ally, despite all the things here. It increases one ally's buff success rate for 3 turns by 20 to 40%. If you have at least 10 critical stars, then it'll increase the critical damage of that ally by 20 to 40% for 3 turns. If you have at least 20 stars, in addition to the critical damage, it will also increase their critical star absorption by 500 to 1500% for 3 turns. If you have at least 30 stars, it will also grant them evasion for 1 turn. If you have at least 40 critical stars, it will also grant them ignore invincibility for 3 turns, and if you have at least 50 critical stars, it will charge their MP gauge by 10 to 20%. That is a lot of buffs, a lot of utility, and a pretty solid critical buff for an ally. On top of that, the best part about this, it does not use the stars for the buffs. It only requires you have them. You get to keep your critical stars. It doesn't require you to absorb them and eat them, so you can still get your criticals off. The problem is, aside from these critical buffs that it gives, it's not that impressive for the very high requirements. 50 critical stars for only 20% MP is really not much. 1 turn of evasion is okay, 3 turns of ignore invincibility is solid, but if you're not a critical focused servant, you're getting very little. It's a great skill if you have a critical servant to work with, or a servant with Imperial privilege to guarantee those buffs and then make use of them, but it's really not impressive for any other type of servant that you can possibly bring. As you can see by her skills and her MP, she's not really designed to be a main damage dealer, but more of a semi-support. She has a lot of debuffs, 1 decent buff in her 3rd skill, but one of the issues is the RNG from her 2nd skill hurts her supporting. Another issue is her 3rd skill. While having all this utility, like I said, the only strong damage buff it has is the critical damage increase and star absorption. That's the only damage buff. The MP charge is laughably low for a 50-star requirement. Higher numbers would help her feel much better. In fact, you can get that critical damage and star absorption buff for absolutely no requirements from other support servants. As she is now, she's just outclassed by a lot of other servants as a main damage dealer, as a support, and even has pretty solid competition from other semi-supports that can do pretty similar jobs to her. But if you do roll Calamity Jane and you want to use her, let's take a look at what materials we need for those skills. Good news! We finally have a servant that doesn't need eggs! Yay! Each skill will require 36 gunpowders, 24 void dusts, 20 permafrost ice, and 20 arrowheads. So to max her out, it's 108 gunpowders, 72 void dust, 60 permafrost, and 60 arrowheads. Overall, relatively cheap, not that expensive. Pretty good to see a servant that doesn't have such high requirements for the first time in quite a while. So, how does Jane stack up against her competition? As a single target 4-star archer, her main competition comes down to Tristan, Swimsuit Anne Bonny and Mary Reed, Chloe von Einsburn, Emiya Alter, Tomoe Gozen, Asagami Fujino, Keiron, and Ashwataman. When it comes to damage dealing, Jane only really beats Keiron and Swimsuit Ann and Mary, unless Swimsuit Ann and Mary are at low health. However, when it comes to semi-supporting, Keiron overall beats her in that role, while dealing similar damage, just not quite as good, along with not having the silly requirements that Jane has and providing almost as much utility with better damage buffs. Jane honestly sits pretty low on this list against her competition because she doesn't do much better than her competition at anything, and when she does do something better, it's either locked behind the silly star requirement or not doing anything better by enough. Again, when it comes to her damage dealing, she's pretty much outclassed by just about everyone on this list. And when it comes to semi-supporting, while she's okay and will beat out the main damage dealers overall, Keiron here as a main role semi-support puts her to shame by not having such ridiculous requirements. So at the end of the day, Jane fits a niche, but that niche is better filled by others. But if you roll for Jane, let's take a look at her skill priority. Despite the massive requirements on her third skill, I say her third skill is definitely the most valuable skill to level up first. It has all this utility, it scales the best out of all of her skills. It's by far the one that you want to level up the most if you plan on making use of her. Next up, you would want to level her second skill because it has the other buff, and buffs are better than debuffs, as I've said before again and again. And finally, last off, her first skill, it doesn't scale very well, so leave that to level up as you please, if at all. As for what craft essences to equip her with, she is a single-target semi-support quick servant that relies heavily on stars. My suggestions are Fragment of 2030 to produce 8, or at max limit break 10 stars per turn. Golden Catches the Carp for 20 starting stars and 50% starting MP gauge, also good on her allies. And Crowning Beauty Greater Glory for 20 starting stars and 10% arts and quick performance bonus. In my opinion, having star generation or having a burst of stars to make her third skill have all of its utility available right away is the best thing that you can do to make Jane work, so you can make sure that she is able to properly give that support to someone, even if it's herself, in the case of if you equipped something like Golden Catches the Carp, maybe. Now, as for what servants to pair her with, oh look, it's Waver! He's here again. Well done, Waver. He has 50% MP charge, attack up, critical damage up. It's a no-brainer to put him on any team that you can think of. If you plan on using Jane as a main attacker, Scotty is your go-to support, with her being the best quick support servant out there. She brings 50% quick up, 100% quick critical damage up, and 50% MP charge for an ally, which are all very, very helpful. An AoE quick servant like Atalanta can produce a ton of stars with her MP, has a 50% quick up for the party for one turn, and is a great choice for a main attacker if you're not against a single target enemy. If you are against a single target enemy, I would suggest someone like Ashwathaman instead. Ashwathaman is a very strong archer for her to support, as he brings Defense Shred on his Buster cards, increased critical damage on his quick cards, so he works very well with critical support like what Jane can provide, and is able to output a pretty decent amount of damage on his own, so having good support helps him feel even stronger. And finally, if you want more wiggle room with your CEs, but you can swap a servant around, Mozart is a really good ally to bring, since he can just provide 50 stars using one skill and fully enable Jane's third skill right away. So a quick too long didn't watch here. Calamity Jane is not great. She's far from good, but she's not horrible. The requirements for her buffs force you to jump through hoops to achieve them. Her buffs aren't even as good as what the usual supports you can have. Her damage output is okay. Her buffs are a bit lackluster. Her debuffs are a bit lackluster. She just really falls behind a lot of the competition out there. Especially as an archer servant, where most of her competition is top quality, S-rank, super good servants. But if you do need a reason to roll for her, well, you get a cute cheerleader Onesan to support you, and everybody wants that, right? Adorable. Let me know your opinions on Calamity Jane, and if you enjoyed this video, follow me on Twitch, join my Discord, and all that stuff. Thank you guys very much for watching, good luck on your rolls, and I'll see you next time on the next Gacha Guide.